Member for Balmain.
Thank you very much, Mr Assistant Speaker. I rise this evening to speak on the Fiscal Responsibility Bill. We've heard a lot about the objects of this bill this evening: to maintain the AAA credit rating, to achieve certain objects. It sets out some fiscal targets and some budget reporting. What's interesting, it shows you the challenges the Treasurer has, because all the members who are speaking on this matter stand up to talk about how much money they've spent. We've spent this money on this project and this project, the money's been spent, so I feel very sympathetic to the Treasurer who has to
fiscal responsibility this bill.
who has to battle members wanting to spend money when we're in fact talking about responsibility. Obviously, Mr Assistant Speaker, it's important that we consider the role that AAA credit rating should fulfil, and this is set out, in my view, in quite an elevated manner in this bill, because one of the problems about the AAA credit rating and the AAA measure is it doesn't in fact measure the underlying economic health of the state, let alone the social and the environmental performance of New South Wales. It's important as well just to recognise who actually determines this AAA rating. It's Standard & Poor's and Moody's. And I think it's important to note that the record of these agencies isn't particularly illustrious. This is especially the case. I know many councillors here have experienced the ratings of the collateralised debt obligations, which were given very high ratings, in particular by Standard & Poor's, and are now in a situation where those catastrophic miscalculations impacted globally, but also in our own local communities. Now, I note also that S&P recently acknowledged they made a $2 trillion error when they were calculating the United States credit rating when that downgrade happened, and I also note that it was Standard & Poor's that were hanging on right at the end, maintaining that rating on Lehman Brothers until, of course, the bitter end came. So, just a point on this matter of AAA before we move on is that these rating decisions of these agencies, they're made by company employees who are not accountable for the decision-making process. There's no appeals process against the credit rating decision. And I make the general observation when talking about credit rating that there does need to be an increased level of accountability and transparency in these agencies when decision-making processes can have huge impacts on what happens here locally, nationally and internationally. It's important, of course, because governments are all about improving accountability and openness, and we'd like to see that, of course, reflected in the agencies that are making such critical decisions about the credit worthiness of sovereign debt and also debt here in New South Wales. While the focus of the bill is, of course, on AAA, it's an opportunity to develop a framework that this government should grasp, and that framework should be one that reflects the real performance of this state. One way to quantify this broader and more relevant criteria for the people and the environment of New South Wales is to adopt a triple bottom line framework. This framework is important to measure a broad range of economic variables as well as environmental measures and social measures. This type of approach can provide us as local members and as a broader community with a real view of the performance of the state in a holistic manner. We see the financial performance of the state being one that's a very important part of the picture, of course, that's critical, but it cannot be divorced from the social and environmental context. And I heard an example recently about economic growth where an economist was saying, well, divorce is great for economic growth. There's lawyers involved, people's houses get sold, houses get bought, but would we be encouraging divorce? Of course we wouldn't. Because while it might promote economic growth and it's measured in terms of growth, it doesn't actually recognise the social and community value that is reduced by divorce and often conflicting personal relationships. So there is an opportunity for us not just to look at AAA, but to look at the other integrated matrix of social and economic and environmental issues. And I can draw the members' attention to one of the principles, and I'll give an example of this. The principle in the bill talks about Part 2.7.4, principle number 3 is achieving intergenerational equity, including ensuring that A, policy decisions are made having regard to their financial effects on future generations. It's very important. Financial effects on future generations are important, but also our environmental effects, also our social effects. So the call that I'm making here today, Mr Temporary Speaker, is that while we welcome these principles, and there needs to be a more integrated framework to us to more fully understand the economic impact, the social impact, and the environmental impact. Now, I know that people from the department will say, oh, triple bottom line is not hard, that's tough, that's a big issue. How do you measure it? What do you include? Well, I'm here, Mr Temporary Speaker, to say that these things do need to be incorporated in a more sophisticated way in order for us to understand in a better way the performance of our state. Because we could well have a AAA credit rating. This state could maintain a AAA credit rating but have very poor social and environmental outcomes. And so it's important that we target measures that are developed to holistically measure our progress in this triple bottom line context. So for the community, of course, and we've heard it today with people attacking the government and the government attacking the Labor Party's record, that the issue isn't really the objective, the issue isn't really the principle, the issue is, well, how will these performance criteria be met? Will it be met by cutting wages, entitlements? Will it be met by over-exploiting natural resources? Will it be met by additional revenue measures? And that really is the test of this government. While there may be many laudable principles and objectives, the test is how those objectives and principles are met and the political decisions that are made on a day-to-day basis. One of the concerns I've had, and I've raised it before in speeches, Mr Temporary Speaker, is the erosion of the tax base that's been occurring under this government. The payroll tax rebate was one that I expressed concern about. $400 million to the largest 10% of businesses in the state. Of course, a tax on employment is not optimal, and there needs to be broader scale tax reform. But as we even heard from our business here in New South Wales, where, quote, feedback from our members has been overwhelmingly indicated that the current scheme is ineffective and is not providing employers with any significant incentive to take on additional staff. The policy hasn't really worked. The government had increased the payroll tax threshold slightly, but this policy hasn't really worked. $400 million that was from that, put towards that. The regional relocation grant hasn't really worked either. It's a good idea, a positive thing to try and take people into rural areas. Take-up's been really poor, $46 million a year allocated. That's almost $300 million originally forecast. And then, of course, the other issue, which you'll know that I've raised concern about, which is the gaming machine tax amendments, which reduces the tax on gaming machines and ensures that registered clubs remain addicted to gambling revenue.
I'll leave the clubs.
So another $300 million. So it is a tight fiscal environment. There's $1 billion. There's $1 billion worth of expenditure in poorly targeted programs that haven't really performed. Even if you take out the registered clubs issue, there's what, $500 million that's been poorly targeted. So where should that be invested when it comes to fiscal responsibility? Where should it be invested? Not what Nick Grinder tells us in mega multi-billion-dollar tollways for the middle of Sydney, destroying the place, but in investment in education and investment, for example, in infrastructure. Now, on the issue, I should say before I go on, as Mayor of Leichhardt and been involved in local government the past 14 years, I've been proud in the last 4 years with a Green-led council that we've increased. The absolute focus has been on basic infrastructure. 25% increase in basic infrastructure spending, roads, stormwater, footpaths, and our debt service ratio. Our debt service ratio has actually declined. And what does the state government measure the financial performance? Debt service ratio, 4.4% under the former council, 2% under this council. So a proportion of debt as a proportion of revenue has halved under the stewardship of the Greens in our local community. And so what it means is that it does need to be a focus on fiscal responsibility locally, in the state, and also federally. And let's talk about investment. I want to talk just quickly about TAFE. If I had that $400 million, I wouldn't give it to the 10% of biggest companies in this state headquartered in Sydney. What I would do is invest in TAFE that has a regional impact, and it has an impact on Sydney. Because let's not forget that in 2006, Allen Consulting Group found that for every dollar invested in TAFE, it generates $6.40 in long-term economic benefits, including improved productivity, higher wages and greater employment. Yet we see state and federal governments taking money away from vocational education. When it comes to investment in infrastructure, every member gets up here and talks about the importance of infrastructure in their community. Not mega billion-dollar projects promoted by Nick Grinder and his mates, that just give more fat cat contracts to the big end of town, but actually investing in public transport, which Transport for New South Wales and Minister Berejiklian may well be supporting.
Light rail, you got light rail in
And so we
Balmain,
know the
what
Roselle
density?
Metro, we know with other projects there have been failures. But this government has an opportunity, this community has an opportunity, and in fact we are looking to this government not to make the mistakes of the past under the former Labor government, but to make sure that three things happen. One, that we have a fiscally responsible state, but one that takes into account social, environmental and financial factors. And there's a responsibility in the government to look at ways to integrate that into the fiscal responsibility of this state. Number two, to make sure that we don't erode the revenue base of this state, and that when money is poorly targeted, as we've seen in regional relocation and in payroll tax rebate, that is changed quickly and immediately to invest in long-term infrastructure, in particular education and health in our community. So I commend this bill, I commend those issues to the House, and I appreciate the House's time in addressing these issues, and look forward to working with the Treasurer and the Minister for Finance in the future to ensure that the government follows through on the commitments that it's making.
Mr.